In the quiet corridors of police stations across the city, a different kind of tension lived, one not born of paperwork or routine arrests, but of shadows lingering in the human psyche. It was the early 1980s, a time when urban streets hummed with life yet held secret, corners where fear festered unnoticed. Officers, trained in law and procedure, often spoke of danger in the abstract, crimes to solve, criminals to catch. But some nights brought encounters that could not be explained by logic alone. In precincts lined with aging wooden desks, fluorescent lights flickered with an almost rhythmic stutter, echoing the nervous heartbeats of those who had walked too close to the inexplicable, whispers of doors opening where no one was, sudden chills brushing the spine, and the uneasy sense of being watched had begun to accumulate into a collective unease. Reports filed as mere disturbances or unknown calls carried an undertone that officers could not name aloud. Among them was Sergeant Michael Rowan, a seasoned officer who had patrolled the city for nearly 2 decades. His recollections, archived in his worn leather notebook, hinted at the first tremors of the echo, a late-night call to a deserted alley, the distant scream of someone who may have never existed, and footprints that led nowhere yet seemed undeniably real. These early moments, though dismissed by some as coincidence, planted seeds of fear that would later bloom into stories no one would dare share publicly. Every beat, every patrol car's idle hum, every radio crackle seemed to carry a hidden message, a warning that the night was more alive than it should have been. It was a subtle beginning, almost imperceptible, a quiet shadow preceding the storm, whispering that not all danger was visible, and not all violence belonged to the human hand. The city slept, but in the minds of those sworn to protect it, sleep often brought only uneasy dreams. A sense of something watching, waiting, perhaps even communicating, began to creep into the consciousness of the men and women who would later recount tales that blurred the line between reality and horror. Before the first terrifying confrontations, there were patterns, strange anomalies that appeared at random times and places. Officers patrolling the outskirts of industrial districts reported lights in empty warehouses, shadows moving against the grain of natural motion, and distant cries that dissolved upon approach. These minor incidents were noted, filed, and forgotten, yet their weight lingered in memory. Detective Laura Mendes, a young officer with sharp instincts, recalled the night a series of anonymous calls led her through abandoned housing blocks. Each time she arrived, the structures were empty, doors ajar, windows shattered, but she could not shake the feeling of eyes tracking her every movement. The wind carried whispers that were not the winds, and a sudden drop in temperature seemed almost purposeful. Colleagues spoke in hushed tones about the echo, a term that began circulating in precincts. It described the inexplicable presence that seemed to follow, taunt, and test the courage of those sworn to uphold order. These shadows were not merely figments of fear. They were persistent, intelligent, and terrifyingly elusive. And yet, beneath the tension, life continued. Calls for burglary, assault, and theft punctuated the long nights. Officers carried out their duties, always with a wary eye on the unseen. The calm before confrontation was deceptive, like a held breath waiting for a storm that only those who had seen it could truly anticipate. The storm finally broke on a night colder than memory itself. The date was March 14, 1983, though for those who lived through it, time afterward seemed to lose its meaning. It began as a standard distress call. Unit 27, respond to 4th and Keller. Possible domestic disturbance. Static filled the radio, heavy and uneven, as if something pressed down on the airwaves. Sergeant Michael Rowan and Detective Laura Mendes arrived at the address, 2-story townhouse, whose windows bled faint light through torn curtains. The neighborhood was still, unnaturally so. Even the wind refused to move. The officers exchanged a look that needed no words, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like hesitant blades. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, a scent both metallic and old, like forgotten iron left to rust in silence. The house appeared deserted, yet every floorboard creaked under invisible weight. A child's toy, a faded teddy bear missing one eye, sat in the middle of the hallway, its head tilted toward the officers as though listening. Then came the first sound, a deep vibration that wasn't quite a noise, more like the earth itself exhaling. Lights flickered. The air turned electric. Mendes called out, voice steady but trembling at the edges. "This is the police. If anyone's here, come out now." The only answer was the rhythmic pounding, slow, deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. Rowan knelt, pressing a gloved hand to the ground. The vibration pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, with a sudden burst of noise, the radio screamed, a distorted voice layered over static. They're not gone. They never left. Every instinct screamed retreat, but training chained them to duty. They moved deeper, down into the basement, where the trembling intensified. And there, in the dim light of their flashlights, they saw what would haunt them for years. Walls marked with handprints too small, too high to belong to any living child, and a door that led nowhere but rattled as if something behind it wanted out. The earth trembled once more, harder this time. A photograph fell from a nail, a family portrait frozen in mid-smile. But behind the glass, someone else had appeared, a face neither officer recognized. The case report the next morning listed it as unsubstantiated disturbance, but both Rowan and Mendez would write privately in their logs that the city felt different that night, as if something beneath its streets had finally awakened. The following nights blurred. Together, endless patrols under a sky that seemed to hum with a low, unseen tension. Reports continued to surface, distorted radio transmissions, missing persons whose trails vanished in a single turn, and calls that came from locations long abandoned. Yet for the officers of the 12th Precinct, one sound became unmistakable, the whispering static that lived between every transmission. Detective Laura Mendez had begun recording her patrol radio, convinced something, or someone, was speaking through it. When replayed at half speed, faint syllables emerged, fragmented phrases, names and pleas that shouldn't have been there. Don't go down. They're waiting, one fragment muttered. Another, more chilling, simply said, we remember. Sergeant Rowan, though skeptical, couldn't dismiss what he felt in the air, a heavy stillness that filled every empty corridor they entered. During one midnight patrol, he parked his cruiser near an old textile mill, long condemned and awaiting demolition. The moment he switched off the engine, the static returned, louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. It was rhythm, pattern, intention. Then came the voice, clear for the first time. Officer down. Basement. Help. Rowan froze. No units had been dispatched in that area. He checked the frequency. It wasn't one of theirs. The voice came again, weaker, breaking apart in fragments. We can't leave. He called for backup, and within minutes, Mendes arrived. Together they entered the mill, walls warped with age, the air thick with mildew and echo. Their flashlights pierced the dark, landing on overturned machinery and scattered tools. Yet every metallic surface seemed to hum faintly with static, as though the air itself was alive with transmission. Down a stairwell half collapsed with rust, they found the remnants of an old security office. Inside, a police radio, cracked, covered in dust, sat on the desk, its red light blinking faintly, though the building had no power. The signal it emitted was steady, pulsing. Mendez leaned close, and through the hiss, a voice whispered again. They never left the basement. The temperature plummeted. Their breath turned visible. A low groan rolled through the walls like thunder under stone. Then, silence. The radio light died, and the static ceased as suddenly as it had begun. When they emerged, the city felt hollow, as though something unseen had followed them out. In their report, they wrote only, area searched. No sign of distress, but both knew what the silence meant. It wasn't over. It was listening. The week that followed was a slow descent into unease. The officers went about their shifts with the discipline of routine, yet every sound, every flicker of light, carried a question they dared not speak aloud. The city seemed normal, traffic lights blinking, sirens wailing, people moving through their lives. But beneath it all was a hum, like the city itself was breathing unevenly. Sergeant Rowan had stopped sleeping. He spent nights reviewing case files that should have made sense but didn't. Reports of figures, seen in mirrors during interrogations, dispatch calls from officers already off duty, and evidence logs showing fingerprints that didn't belong to the living. Mendez visited the precinct chapel, a quiet, forgotten room near the basement, where candles still burned for those lost in the line of duty. She wasn't a religious woman, yet something in her needed light, however fragile. Maybe it's us, she said quietly one evening, staring at the flicker of a single candle. Maybe we've been here too long, seen too much. Rowan didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of belief beginning to crack. That same night, the precinct's emergency generator failed. The lights went out. Radios hissed back to life on their own, filling the dark with a rising wall of static. Then, beneath it, came the same voice they'd heard in the mill. "Help. Basement, please." This time it was followed by another voice, different yet somehow familiar. "Don't follow the light." The words seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some officers shouted, others prayed. Rowan gripped the edge of the dispatch. Deska's drawers rattled in the hallway lights, flickered on and off in rhythmic bursts. Morse code, perhaps, or something older. Mendez, her voice steady despite her shaking, whispered a prayer. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The lights stabilized. The radios went silent. But on the chapel wall, soot from the extinguished candles had formed shapes. The faint outline of numbers, coordinates, a place on the outskirts of the city. For the first time, the fear turned into purpose. Rowan and Mendez knew the pattern wasn't random. It was leading them somewhere. To something. Faith, fragile as glass, clung to duty. If the voices wanted them to see, they would go, not out of courage, but out of the desperate hope that the truth, however terrifying, might finally silence the echo. By the time dawn crept across the city, the precinct felt hollow, not merely quiet, but emptied of something vital. Conversations were shorter. Laughter had vanished. Even the coffee tasted of rust. The static had stopped, yet every officer knew it wasn't gone. Silence, they had learned, could scream louder than any voice. The coordinates burned into Mendez's mind. 41.7239 degree N, 73.8921 Grodic W, a patch of woodland outside the city, long abandoned after a fire 2 decades earlier. Rowan pulled the old property records. The land had once housed a training facility, built for tactical exercises and later shut down after a classified incident. The files were redacted, entire pages blacked out by heavy ink. What remained were fragments. Containment breach. Unauthorized experiment. Do not reopen. But curiosity is a cruel kind of faith, and duty, once twisted by the unknown, becomes obsession. Against protocol, they drove out to the site. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. Trees leaned like eavesdroppers, branches skeletal under a pale sun. The foundation of the facility still stood. Concrete fractured. Steel doors rusted shut. Rowan forced one open. The smell that rolled out was heavy with rot and memory. Inside, the air hung thick and stale, filled with the faint hum of something electrical, though there was no power. Then they found the first relic, an old filing cabinet, toppled and rusted, its drawers filled with faded documents. Mendez brushed off the dust and read aloud. Project, Echo, Purpose, Behavioral Resonance Testing. Participants, local law enforcement volunteers. Her voice faltered. The next page bore signatures, names they knew. Officers from their own precinct. Men and women long retired or dead. "What is this?" Rowan muttered. But he already knew. The echoes weren't ghosts. They were experiments. Remnants of minds fractured and left behind. The voices on the radio, the whispers and static. They were not calling for help. They were calling from it. A door at the far end of the corridor creaked open by itself. The walls trembled faintly, dust falling like ash. Rowan lifted his flashlight and saw a row of old helmets hanging from nails, each marked with a number. The last one bore his badge number. For the first time, he felt the ground tilt beneath him, not from fear, but recognition. They weren't just uncovering a secret. They were part of it. Forgotten orders, buried deep by those who once controlled the silence. As they turned to leave, the radio on Rowan's belt flickered to life. A voice, calm, deliberate, unmistakably human, whispered, "You were never meant to remember." The light in the facility flickered once, then died. Years passed, but for Detective Laura Mendez, time never really moved forward, it only folded. Each new dawn felt like an echo of the same night, the same static, the same haunting silence that had followed them from the ruins. She left the force in 1986, quietly, without ceremony. No badge turned in, no goodbye drinks, no mention of the echo case. She simply walked out one afternoon and didn't return. Now, in her small apartment overlooking the river, the city hummed below her like a half-remembered dream. The police scanners still murmured faintly from her shelf, though they hadn't worked properly in years. Sometimes, when the night was still, she could hear it again, that rhythm, that pulse, the voice that once whispered from between frequencies. we remember. Her notebooks, filled with trembling handwriting, chronicled everything the reports had erased. Dates, names, sounds, coordinates, and sketches of what she'd seen in the facility before it burned. The handprints on the wall, the helmets, the face in the photograph. Over time, the words blurred into something less like documentation and more like confession. She spoke occasionally to a recorder, the same one she had used in the precinct chapel all those years ago. Her voice, older now, steadier but burdened, drifted through the static like a prayer. They told us to protect the city, but no one warned us what the city was protecting. Mendez had come to believe that the echo wasn't a thing, not an experiment, not a haunting, but a resonance of guilt itself. A frequency born from the memories of those who'd done what they were told, even when it was wrong. It fed on silence, on the unspoken weight between duty and truth, and perhaps she thought that was why it never truly died. One night she awoke to the faint crackle of the old police radio. It glowed faintly red, though it had no power source. A single transmission played, short, broken, but unmistakable. "Laura, it's Mike." Her breath caught. Rowan had been missing since the fire. No record, no trace. She whispered to the dark, "Where are you?" The radio hissed, then fell silent, but on the window pane, the condensation formed the faint outline of a hand. The next morning, her neighbor reported hearing voices, one male, one female, speaking softly until dawn. But when they knocked, the apartment was empty. Only the recorder remained, its tape still turning, filled with nothing but quiet static, and faintly, the sound of someone breathing on the other side. Decades later, the world had moved on. The city, rebuilt and bright with glass towers, bore little resemblance to the shadowed streets that once swallowed the old precinct whole. To most, the past was buried, just another forgotten chapter in the long history of urban decay. But for those who searched through archives and dust, time had left traces that refused to fade. In 2021, a young historian named Elias Voss began a research project on unexplained law enforcement, anomalies of the 20th century. His work was academic, detached, until he stumbled across an unmarked box in the city's municipal storage facility. Inside, beneath brittle folders and a corroded badge, lay a reel-to-reel audio tape labeled only. Project Echo, Field Recordings, 1983. The sound was faint at first, just static, the kind that filled dead air. But as the tape played, words began to emerge. Fragmented voices, overlapping like multiple timelines bleeding into one another. He heard the call signs of officers long deceased, the sound of distant thunder, a woman whispering through static, "They never left." Elias spent nights alone in his small office, surrounded by the faint hum of playback equipment and the ghosts of recorded breath. The deeper he listened, the more the tape seemed to change, as if reacting to him. New voices appeared, ones that hadn't been there before. One night he froze when a male voice, deep and calm, said clearly, "Elias, don't dig." The next morning he found the lights in his office flickering, his computer corrupted. Files from the city archive he had digitized were gone, overwritten with a single phrase repeated endlessly. "Echo lives." Curiosity turned to obsession. He traced the coordinates etched faintly on the E. Tape's label, the same woodland that had burned decades ago. Satellite images showed nothing unusual, just a dark patch of soil surrounded by thriving forest. But when he visited, his equipment malfunctioned within minutes. Compass needles spun in circles. His recording devices picked up faint rhythmic pulses, 5 beats, then silence, then 5 again. As dusk fell, he noticed something buried in the soil. A rusted police radio, half melted, its red light blinking faintly beneath the dirt. He lifted it carefully. The static returned, sharp, alive. And then and through the hiss and he heard them. Rowan's voice, Mendez's voice, layered over each other like twin echoes trapped in time. We tried to forget. Time didn't. That night, Elias returned to the city, shaken. He filed a short report but never published his findings. His final note, handwritten and unsigned, was found weeks later on his desk. They were not chasing ghosts. They became them. The tape was sealed again, this time under a new label marked in red ink. Restricted. Evidence of temporal resonance, do not replay. The box was sealed again, its edges marked with the quiet finality of bureaucracy, a paper lock for something that could never truly be contained. Years passed. New officers filled the precinct halls. The old radios were replaced by digital networks. Their signals clear, flawless, clinical, and yet, every so often, a whisper would still bleed through, faint, distorted, half a word carried on frequencies no one could trace. By 2043, the story of Project Echo had become little more than rumor, a ghost tale shared in police academies, a cautionary myth about hearing things that aren't there. But myths, like static, always find their way back into the signal. A new recruit once asked the chief about the rumor. The chief, older now, simply said, "It was before my time," and walked away. Yet that night, long after everyone had gone home, he sat alone in his office, staring at an old, burned badge encased in glass, the numbers barely visible beneath the soot. His hand trembled as he reached for the drawer, pulling out a relic no one else knew he kept. A small radio, dented, half-rusted, the kind they stopped using 40 years ago. He turned it on. For a moment, there was nothing. Then drew a faint crackle. "This is Unit 27. A pause. And we found it again. The chief froze. His throat tightened, eyes burning with something older than fear. He turned the dial slowly, and through the static, a woman's voice emerged, faint but unmistakable. "We're still here, sir. We never left." The lights flickered once. Then again. On the wall, his shadow split into two, one slightly delayed, as if light itself couldn't decide which time it belonged to. The sound in the room deepened into a low, rhythmic pulse. Outside, thunder rolled through the skies were clear. The city's electrical grid surged for precisely 11 seconds, just long enough to send every police radio, every emergency channel into unified static. Officers across the city paused mid-sentence, mid-call, mid-breath, listening to the same unbroken hum. Some swore they heard words in it. Others refused to speak at all. And then silence. No trace was ever found of the chief, only the faint smell of ozone, a thin line of soot on the office wall, and a single message left on the station system log. Echo complete. Listening continues. The city resumed its rhythm. Cars moved. Sirens wailed. Life returned to its mechanical hum. But beneath that hum, in the smallest frequencies, something else breathed, patient, constant, eternal. Because time does not forget. It listens. And in its silence the voices of the lost still speak, carried not by air, but by the memory of those who dared to listen. Time remembers what men forget, and the silence of their stories still drifts through the ruins. End of series. Police Confessions, the scariest cases they've faced. Chrono Mysteries Edition.